Today we'll be reviewing emergency vents or E-vents on the primary and secondary of an above ground storage tank. Here at MPTI's Outdoor Training Center, we have this 5,000 gallon UL 142 double wall steel tank. It has a E-vent on the primary and the secondary. And so let's take a closer look at that. So first let's get into the tools and equipment that may be needed to inspect an emergency vent. Not a lot is needed, but you need a tape measure to be able to identify the diameter of the different openings in the tank. You will need a flashlight so that you can pry things up and look inside of things to see if there's anything obstructing it. You may need some tools in case these are seized to open them up. Definitely need a camera, obviously, to take pictures of everything. And absolutely always need your safety gear. Obviously, here at MPTI, we're standing on the safety deck, which is above the tank. Gives us nice, easy access. But normally you'd be either on a catwalk, or you may be standing on a ladder, or you may need to follow safety protocols for the place where you're at and have a full harness with a tie-off point to the tank. So always need your safety gear. So there are three main types of emergency vents. The first one would be a weighted lid, which is more this style. The lid is fairly heavy and is secured down with a bolt through the center to the housing, and it's threaded in. The second style would be a lightweight aluminum with a spring that allows it to easily travel up and down. Very lightweight compared to these heavier models. And the last one would be a long bolt manway. A long bolt manway would look similar to this in the sense of this is the manway to get down into the tank, except the bolts would be long. So they would extend down 1.5 inches to allow the lid to basically move up and down, and then it would be a couple other factors we'll get into. So let's talk about the weighted lid for first. The weighted lid, here's a smaller example. In the top of the weighted lid, it has embossed in it the UL stamp, first off. So we want to make sure that we see that. The second thing is we would want to see the cubic feet per hour rating of the vent. Each one of these is different. It's based upon how far open it will extend, the size, diameter, the weight of the lid. Each one is different. So you have to read through that. And then the last thing you want to do is you want to be able to measure and figure out what the diameter is this. This is a 4-inch one. This is an 8-inch. Each tank has a different size requirement, and we'll get into that in a second. So that's a weighted lid emergency vent. Spring-loaded is very similar. Again, this one's cast in. It's a little easier to read than these painted models. So again, we're looking for the UL label. We're looking for the cubic feet per hour rating for what this will allow the amount of air to flow through when it's opened. And then we're also checking again the diameter. These could be, again, threaded. This is a female connection. This is a female connection. This is a male where it threads in, or it could be a flange connection. So a couple different styles. And again, these are the beauty of these is that they're very lightweight. So if I was trying to put a lightweight 8-inch one on top of a tank, this would be a lot easier to install versus this heavy one, which weighs around 20, 30 pounds. So the long bolt manway, let's talk about that for one more second. Again, every other bolt would be missing from here. We would want to see a nice smooth bolt with the shaft so that it would allow the lid to move up and down. Typically it's 1.5 inches, but it could be longer if it's a larger tank, 40,000 gallon or 50,000 gallon. Easy to identify. The inspector on the ground should be able to look up and easily see none of the original bolts. So when they test these tanks, they bolt it tight like we have it here. Once they're done testing the tank, they would remove all those bolts and install the long bolt to allow the lid to move up and down only on the primary. So that would only be an emergency vent for the primary. For the secondary, if it's a double wall tank, it would have to have one of these style, either a weighted lid or a spring-loaded lid. So those are the three main types of emergency vents that you may come across on an above ground tank. Again, if it's a double wall tank, you should have two. If you have a long bolt manway, that's only for the primary, not for the secondary. So let's take a closer look at some things that we want to inspect on an emergency vent. First off is we want to check and make sure that it is properly sized for the tank. A lot of times contractors may have a different emergency vent on their truck, and they may put a 4-inch like this one instead of a 6-inch or 8-inch that's required. So to properly identify what's required for that tank, there sometimes is a sticker from the manufacturer right next to where the emergency vent should be installed, and it will state not necessarily the size. You can measure the opening of the tank, but you can see what the cubic feet per hour rating is for the tank, for the primary, if it's a double wall, the secondary as well. So we want to identify, take a picture, note what that is on the tank sticker. In addition to what the emergency vent is rated for, we also want to identify what the tank is. So that sticker may state the exact cubic feet per hour that the tank primary or secondary, and they could be different, so pay attention to that, what that requirement is. And what we want to do is make sure that the emergency vent exceeds that, meets or exceeds that. If there isn't a sticker on the tank, you can either bring the chart with you in the field, or you can go and do this back at your office. But you can pull up a pre-calculated data sheet which identifies the diameter of the tank, the capacity, and the different information, and it tells you what generally the required venting capacity would be. So on this chart, we can see that the tank that we are looking to identify the venting requirements for a 5,000 gallon tank is around 276,000 cubic feet per hour. And the emergency vent that's installed on that tank is rated for 455,000 cubic feet per hour. So clearly we are exceeding that requirement, and therefore that emergency vent definitely meets and exceeds the minimum requirements. The cubic feet per hour rating we talked about is stamped usually in the top of the emergency vent. So we would want to zoom in, look at that. Sometimes you may need a flashlight, it might be painted to be able to accurately read what that is. This one is only rated at 115,000 cubic feet per hour, so this is obviously too small. So again, we want to identify the proper size and cubic feet per hour rating of the emergency vent and what the tank is requiring. Another item to look at on a weighted lid or a spring lid is the seal connection between the lid and the actual housing body. So they should move freely back and forth, but sometimes they haven't been inspected, looked at in a long time. And so you may be the first person that is actually going to pry it open or open it to inspect. And what we're looking for is either an O-ring on the inside, there may be a brass gasket. If it's a long bolt manway, it may have a cork gasket or a nitrile gasket. But what we want to do on any of these is lift them up and use our flashlight, use a mirror, use something to inspect that connection between the two surfaces and make sure that it's not rusted and corroded and damaged or the O-ring's gone. So we want to, again, pry it open, take a closer look at that item, and inspect that specific part of the emergency vent. In this case, a red O-ring. It might be a brass gasket. For a long bolt manway, it would be a nitrile or cork gasket. But in this case, we want to look at that O-ring and make sure that it's intact and it's in good condition. So after we've inspected that O-ring, that gasket, that seal, we want to make sure that the lid, either of the long bolt manway, seats back down as it should, evenly along the gasket. If it's a weighted lid, we want to make sure that it sits back down. One thing to note on a double wall tank that's a UL 2085 and it has that lightweight concrete, this bolt is sliding up and down, and when that bolt slides up and down, the concrete underneath may keep it a little bit up when you lower it back down in. So when you pick the lid up and you lower it back down in, make sure that it actually seats, and so that there's a nice good seal all the way around of the emergency vent, so that when you leave, you're not leaving the emergency vent slightly ajar, which is allowing the tank, number one, to be venting all the time through that like a normal vent, and second, it would allow insects, moisture, water, and all that to get down inside the tank. So after you're done inspecting it, make sure it goes back down in, it moves freely, it's not seized up, and put it back the way that you saw it. So a couple last points for what we're looking for on emergency vents. They're required on primary and secondaries of a tank. So if you have a double wall tank, you need to have an emergency vent on both. A lot of times when these tanks are installed, they are shipped with shipping plugs. It could be a little plastic insert, it could be a PVC plug. Sometimes contractors don't actually remove those shipping plugs and test the tank per the proper protocol, and then they also don't install the emergency vents. So keep an eye out for a 4-inch, 6-inch, 8-inch, or larger, something like that, plug in the tank. PVC is a dead indicator that it came from the factory like that, and they didn't take the time to remove that PVC plug and actually install the emergency vent. Lots of times tanks are painted, these stickers and labels come off, and so that's not going to be a dead giveaway. But the larger opening in the tank is usually the indication that that was built for the emergency vent connection from the tank manufacturer. They also could not always be threaded. Look for flange connections as well for that. So a couple final things to note about inspecting emergency vents. Again, remember, always note the cubic feet per hour rating. It should be stamped right on the top of the emergency vent. Also, you need to know what the tank requires. If you remember, we had our venting guide, or you may look at the sticker that's on the tank and it clearly states what the cubic feet per hour rating was. You need to know those two things and make sure that's documented clearly. Photos of the vent, photos of this rating, nice and clear to include in your report, and also of what the tank may be requiring. And last but not least, is the UL vent, or is the vent UL approved? It should be stamped right in the top of it. Some of them, I believe, have stickers and it's stamped on that or written on that. And then there's other emergency vents that have no approvals, no ratings, nothing. So be on the lookout for those.